This webinar is part of a series of webinars presented through the partnership of River Network and Groundwork USA for the Urban Waters Learning Network, which is funded under a grant from the US EPA's Office of Water. And I've heard that many of you are running or considering running a volunteer water quality program. So we all know that it takes a lot of effort and care to do programs like that. And many organizations look to partnering as a way of doing the work that's needed. So today we're very pleased to have Merritt Fry of River Network present this webinar on creative partnerships and volunteer water quality monitoring. What works? Merritt Fry, was River Network's Habitat Program Director, has over 15 years of experience in the clean water policy arena and is well versed in the alphabet soup like TMDLs and numeric labeled 401 systems and is still standing. And we are very pleased to have her spend some time with us today. All right, why don't you go ahead and tell us how you're going to do the presentation today?
Great. Well, thanks so much for that introduction. So is a little bit of logistics before we dive into the content for today. Our webinar system here is something that has a couple bells and whistles I want to explain. The first is something I've already mentioned. If you are on the phone line listening through your phone, please hit *6 to mute yourself so that we are not hearing your side conversations. That can be embarrassing for everybody. And also just kind of background noise is annoying. So mute yourself. You can unmute yourself when we get to questions and answers if you'd like to, verbalize your questions. If you're listening through your computer, or if you'd rather use this function to ask questions, please note that on your screen you'll see a box that says chat. That's kind of how we'll have some interaction throughout the webinar. It'll allow you to type in questions or comments. If you have additional resources you want to share with the group, you can do it through that chat box. So we'll be using that, and I'll be trying to monitor it, and I will answer questions that seem like they are good clarifying questions for everybody throughout the presentation. I also reserve the right, though, to kind of save those up for, I think there's 5 points throughout the presentation where I'll pause for question and answer. So if it's a question that maybe requires more of a discussion or, is a bigger break in the presentation, I might save up your question until we get to one of those breaking points. And that's also a place where you might pause and think about if you have a question and type one in for me. So use that chat function, and you can see it there. It's on the left-hand side of your screen. The other kind of interactive tool that we have at our disposal is at the very top of your screen. You'll see what looks like a little image of a man raising his hand, or maybe a woman, a person raising their hand. You can use that to respond to questions that I might ask throughout the presentation, and I'm going to kind of try that with you guys a little bit here at the beginning. So just to make sure you guys know what I'm talking about, raise your hand if you found that raise your hand button at the top of the screen. All right, it looks like you guys are either already know about this or are quick studies. We've got hands going up all over the place. All right, so go ahead and unraise your hand. That's just clicking that button again. I'll take your hand down. So that's another way that we can interact. And again, if you're on the phone line, when we get to those question slides, there'll be these 5 breaks in the presentation. Feel free to unmute yourself by hitting *6 again and ask your question verbally. One other note, we are being recorded, so hopefully that won't make anybody feel shy about asking questions. Instead, think of it as another reason to ask your question, because people will be watching this recording or listening to it online. They won't be able to ask questions. Chances are if you have a question, they probably are going to have that question as well and will appreciate that you've raised it. So don't be shy in terms of raising questions. So before we dive in, I want to get a little bit of a feel for who we have on the webinar. So I'm going to use those tools we just talked about, starting with the raise your hand button, and ask how many of you that are on this webinar are already involved in a volunteer monitoring program. Maybe your organization has one already. Maybe you're a volunteer yourself in a program. Let's see here. Our hands going up. It looks like quite a few of you. Maybe not all of you, but I'm trying to do an estimate here. Maybe about a third or a quarter of you are currently involved in a volunteer monitoring program. Okay. Of those folks who are currently involved in a program, how many of you partner with another organization or maybe a governmental entity or a school group to do your volunteer monitoring program? How many of you use partnering as part of your strategy? Boy, it looks like pretty much everybody who's involved in a program, more or less, maybe one less, is using partnering as part of the way to deliver that programming. So that's great. Okay, well, one other question I wanted to ask here is something that's going to use the chat function. So for those of you who are involved in volunteer monitoring and maybe are partnering, who do you partner with? Maybe just use the chat, and I'm thinking generally, like, is it another nonprofit? Is it a state government agency? Is it a K through 12 school group? Maybe just share a little bit about who you're partnering with. We've got a couple of people typing here, so I'll just let people take their time to type. And I'll say I kind of lied. I do have one other question I want to ask you guys. Okay, so everybody can see the answers in chat there. It looks like a variety here. So there's governments partnering with local nonprofits. There's folks that are partnering with governments, whether it's state or EPA, some school group. Interestingly, recreational outfitters, so maybe more like a business partner there. That's great. So you can see there's a real range here in terms of the responses. We've got a couple others coming up, a similar kind of mix of agencies, other nonprofits, again, local businesses. I'm really glad to see how much local business sponsorship we're looking at here. Okay, great. Well, one more question then, and this is for everybody, whether or not you're currently involved in water quality monitoring, a volunteer program. You came to this webinar maybe because you're curious about the idea of being engaged in one and maybe partnering to make that happen. So chat, if you're thinking about this topic, what kinds of skills or resources are you interested in partnering to get? So maybe you're looking for a partner that has technical expertise that you don't have, or maybe you're looking for a partner that has a great source of volunteers that you feel like you don't really have one to tap into. What kinds of skills or resources do you think a partnership might bring to any future programming that you're pondering doing on volunteer monitoring? Again, we've got a ton of people typing here. Okay, so generally just looking for guidance, money, volunteers, lab, data analysis, kind of covering a lot of ground there. More volunteer partners, more advanced skills, again, maybe more technologically advanced stuff. That's great, okay. So we're going to see that this is really in keeping with the material of the webinar. What you all are looking for is what we're hearing a lot. Just generally guidance and expertise, getting the first flush off a storm event, so a really specific need there. Okay, that's great. That gives me some context for things I might focus on a little bit more, a little bit less throughout the webinar. But again, feel free to break in at all points with your chat questions or comments or other ideas that you might have that you want to share with the group. All right, so with that, let's dive into our plans for today. So this webinar is focused on the general idea of providing you all with some ideas for incorporating partnership into either existing or perhaps new volunteer monitoring efforts that you're pondering designing. So one thing I wanted to start off by saying is this is not an overview of volunteer monitoring programming or how to set up a program or best practices for volunteer monitoring. What I will do is at the end of the presentation, I have a resources slide, and I've put in a couple places you could go to if you want to just learn more generally about those kinds of topics. We're really going to focus in, for the most part, on the partnership aspect of this question. So just so you know, if what you're really looking for is more kind of generally, wow, how do volunteer monitoring programs work? You're probably not going to get that out of this presentation, but I will try to point you to some resources that can help with that. So for today, the context for this webinar is that what we've found at River Network is that river and watershed groups or community groups are often struggling to kind of secure the financial and technical capacity you need to conduct good, scientifically credible long-term monitoring, particularly if you want to try to get to the level of documenting success or failure in terms of protecting or improving water quality or habitat. So if you're engaged in restoration efforts, it's big investment and often a long-term investment to monitor what results you're seeing from those projects. And what we notice is that as all the budget concerns have really come to the forefront more than ever over the last several years, and budgets have just shrunk, these types of challenges have only kind of loomed larger on people's minds. So one strategy for stretching our water quality monitoring resources is to partner with others who might bring complementary skills or resources to the table. Um, so what we did, that this webinar is based on, is we did a short report. It's the first, actually, of a series we call What Works. And this is like a non-academic research paper. This is a short and pithy report series that focuses in on some general data on a specific question, and then really focuses on case studies, looking at what organizations on the ground have been doing around that issue and what lessons they may have learned in doing that work. So it's really kind of like a way to share peer-to-peer among watershed groups or other community organizations what they've tried and what lessons they would want to share with their peers about that experience. So for this particular one, we're focused in on this idea of how partnerships might help in eras of shrinking budgets and other concerns related to resources on monitoring. And we're going to present two types of information that came out of that report. The first is just the results of a short national survey we did of folks involved in volunteer monitoring projects about partnering and what they find from their partnerships. And then spend more time, hopefully, on a selection of case studies, again, demonstrating these lessons learned from different types of partnerships. And again, the goal is really just to provide you with creative ideas. None of these case studies are going to be exactly like your situation, and none of them are going to be the exact, cookie cutter approach you need to take. But hopefully, with the lessons learned, you'll get some food for thought, things you might want to think about as you're designing your program, things you might want to think about in terms of, is partnering right for you in this situation, and how you might set up their partnership, if so, those kinds of general lessons. So that's kind of my caveat. Like all things, this is not a one-size-fits-all approach. You're just going to have to kind of sort through and think about what really applies to you. So our agenda for today is I'm going to give a quick introduction, that is the summary of the survey that we did for context, and then we're going to focus in on three case studies. You can see here the Waccamaw River of North and South Carolina, Johnson Creek in Oregon, and the Raccoon River in Iowa. And then we're going to have hopefully a little bit of discussion. It might be more like question and answer because of the webinar format, but kind of a little back and forth. And then I'll wrap up with these learning resources that I promised you, kind of some places you can go to learn more. Between each of these sections, I will stop and see if there's any questions. So again, if you want to type those in, you can do it as we go, or you can do it when we come to those break points. But we'll try to break and make sure everybody's still on board. So with that, I'm going to jump into the summary of this survey that we did. Again, this is not a big academic, kind of level of survey. It was a survey that River Network conducted back in the spring of 2012, so relatively recently, but a little bit dated. We circulated the survey invitation to our partner listserv, which is largely watershed and river groups, but others as well. And then we also sent it to the volunteer monitoring listserv, so two pretty targeted places to get folks who are involved in these types of volunteer monitoring projects. It was also forwarded around. As far as I can tell, folks did share it with other listservs or just people that they knew, but it was pretty targeted to these types of watershed and community groups that are already engaged in water issues and in many cases with volunteer monitoring issues. We had just 82 responses total, so the caveat here is this is not a huge data pool, but it was fairly wide, well spread across the country, represented. We'll see a big focus on nonprofit organizations. That was the majority of the respondents, but also had a good group of folks from government and then some other interests as well. And we only asked 10 very basic questions. So again, this is just kind of an overview of what's going on with partnerships currently and what folks might have that we could learn from in terms of what they've been doing. So what I'm going to do is focus in on the data from the survey, just from the nonprofit answers and then from the government answers. Those are the two groups most represented on this webinar. And again, the nonprofits is a big, healthy sample. Comparatively, it was 50 odd responses, and we have about 20 from government, so that's a smaller pool. So I'm going to start with nonprofits and then talk a little bit about the government responses. So in terms of the nonprofit responses, oh, that's weird. Ryan, my graphics aren't showing up. I don't know if there's anything you can do about it at this point, but it looks like some of the pie charts are not coming through. So I can talk you through this one, though. So we asked nonprofits that were responding to the survey, if they were involved in volunteer monitoring projects, if they incorporated partnerships as part of their strategy for delivering services. And of our respondents, 87%, that's the pie chart you can't see here, said that they did use partnerships as part of their delivery mechanism for their volunteer monitoring program. So that's a pretty high percentage. It's probably a little skewed because probably people who were interested in responding to the survey, it had partnership in its title that may have, made it more likely that folks involved in partnerships would respond. So about 87% of the respondents said that they did, in fact, partner to get their volunteer monitoring work done. And when we asked them who they partnered with, the most common answer for nonprofits was universities or colleges. You can see that's closely followed, though, by state governments, and not too far behind are local governments. So that would be like counties, cities, that kind of thing. So big focus here on universities and then these more localized units of government. Not in the top three. We had about half of the respondents who said they partnered with another nonprofit. And then about 38% that said they partnered with K through 12 schools, so not the university level, but more school programming. Coming in right at the back end, federal agencies came in last with just about 23% saying that they partnered with a federal agency. So probably not too surprising in terms of the partners for nonprofits. I have a question here that says, what was the percentage of local citizens? That's a good question. You could think of like people participating in a monitoring program as partners. What we were looking at here were more like organizational partners. So a program might have 100 citizen volunteers, but they might partner with a university in terms of delivering the training or getting, equipment from the university or what have you. So it's just kind of maybe a terminology difference. Those local citizens would be thought of as more participants as opposed to partners. So all of these are volunteer programs, so they all would have that local citizen engagement. The next question we asked nonprofits is, well, okay, so you have these partners. What skills do you see you kind of bring to the partnership that your partners, are taking advantage of? Why do they want you as a partner? And nonprofits generally, probably not surprisingly, rank themselves very highly on people skills, volunteer training and maintenance, volunteer recruitment. Volunteer recruitment was tied with public education, kind of that outreach aspect. Again, probably not surprising. A lot of our respondents are watershed groups or community organizations. They probably have volunteer programs for other things. This is a skill that a lot of us feel like we have. So we rated ourselves pretty highly on that. Maybe a little more surprisingly, the technical expertise ranking here came out third. So nonprofits were seeing themselves as really bringing some technical chops to the table, which I think is, again, maybe not what people tend to think of, especially maybe with smaller nonprofits. They might tend to pigeonhole them and think that they're not, not having that kind of capacity. But at least when we rate ourselves pretty highly on technical expertise. There then was a relatively large drop in terms of how nonprofits ranked themselves on other factors, other skills that they might bring to the table. So those dropped off pretty dramatically from here. And perhaps not surprisingly, the nonprofits ranked themselves the lowest in terms of their contribution, their skills in bringing funding to the table. So when it came to money, that was kind of the thing that folks felt like they brought at least measure to a partnership. So next we asked nonprofits to think not about themselves, but about their current partners and what those partners bring to the table. And again, you can see the top three here, technical expertise and equipment tied at nearly 60% of the group saying that that was a really important skill that their partners brought to the table, or skill or capacity that their partners brought to the table. And then applying the data, this is applying the data is kind of shorthand for using the data. So it might be making sure that data gets incorporated into a watershed management plan, or a discussion about a city ordinance, or the state's identification of which waters are impaired, not meeting their water quality standards. It's basically using the data in some way. And then number three, providing funding. They felt like their partners, at least half of the groups felt like that was a really important aspect that the partners were currently bringing to the table. All the other factors ranked fairly low comparatively. All of the others were clearly below 50%. And public outreach and education came in last. So there was about 33% of the partners, of the nonprofits that felt their partners were bringing that to the table. So probably not too surprising here. You can see that we're really having partnerships that are based on this bringing together of nonprofits' strengths, maybe in volunteer management, recruitment, et cetera, and that maybe what they've been looking for, or at least finding in partners, is this technical expertise and maybe the application of the data. But then we next asked nonprofits, okay, so that's your current partners, what they bring to the table. If you could have your perfect partner, your dream date partner, what would they bring to the partnership? And probably no surprise that funding came in far and away in first place. I mean, we all want money. So you can see 90% of people thought that that would be their number one dream date kind of capacity. And then it drops down pretty dramatically to technical expertise and applying the data. So that's consistent with what they're getting from their current partners in terms of their dream partner. But that funding question really bumps up when you think about your dream partner in this scenario. The other factors, they came in, again, all lower than 50%, ranking it as something that they thought was, their dream date. Equipment came in at about 40%. Help with database support or data storage was next with about 30%. And then the remainder were all quite low. So things like volunteer recruitment, et cetera, didn't, come in very high at all, which, again, probably makes sense since nonprofits report feeling pretty confident in that arena. So none of the graphs are coming through, Ryan. We're going to have to work on this for future webinars, but we won't bother you guys with this. I'll just describe the graphs. There aren't that many of them. So the last question we asked nonprofits was if the economic downturn of recent years had made them more likely, less likely, or had not changed their interest in partnering. And what we found with the nonprofits is it made them somewhat more interested in partnering. It wasn't an overwhelming response. About half, 53% of the nonprofits said that they were very much more likely or somewhat more likely to be looking for partners in their volunteer monitoring program based on this recent economic kind of upheaval. However, about 42% said that it hadn't changed their inclination to partner at all. And 4% actually said they were somewhat less likely to partner. So you can see there's definitely an inclination to partner more, but it's not necessarily overwhelming in terms of a response. So I'm just going to talk about the same data quickly with the government folks. So when we asked the government respondents if they incorporated partnerships into their volunteer monitoring program strategies, we had a similar response, a little bit less. 83% of the governmental respondents said, yes, we really use partnering as part of the strategy to deliver our volunteer monitoring programming. So it's still pretty huge response, pretty healthy response, but not quite as robust as the nonprofits. I will say for all the government data, I'll remind you that we only had about 20 respondents in this category. So you should really take it all a little bit with a grain of salt, and especially if you think about the fact that this includes such a range of governments. There were federal agencies, there were state government types, there were local governments. And so, depending on who you're talking with, it might really change how they think about their answers to some of these questions. And with such a small data pool, we couldn't really break those apart and have any kind of meaningful numbers to share with you guys. So they're all lumped together. So when we asked governments who they partner with, the most common partner was nonprofits. So that's good. And then local governments came in second, and the remainder were all under 50%. There was a real focus here in this data on nonprofits. Probably the closest one here after local governments was K through 12 schools. That was about 47% said that they did in fact partner with schools. After that, it dropped off even more. So nonprofits are really the focus of governmental partnerships in volunteer monitoring. And when we asked the governments what they saw themselves bringing to the table in any kind of partnerships, it was unanimous that they felt confident in their technical expertise. So you see 100% said this is something we can really bring to a partnership. And that kind of jives with what we saw from the nonprofits in terms of interest and need. So that's a good data point. Governments also saw themselves as being able to bring equipment, so maybe monitoring kits or meters or what have you, to these partnerships. The third one kind of surprised me. They ranked themselves fairly high on volunteer training and maintenance. When I thought about it a little more, it did make some sense. Again, there's a lot of, say, state volunteer monitoring programs that put a lot of time and effort into this arena. So, again, not just the tech geeks at the government agencies. They have some real skills in volunteer training and maintenance. And then this idea of applying the data, I included it there fourth because it was so close to the third. And again, it makes sense that a lot of times we are, as nonprofits, really looking to the government's agencies to take and use this data at whatever level they're at, whether it's a local or state agency or even the federal agencies. I will note one of the interesting things was although the governmental folks ranked themselves pretty high on volunteer training and maintenance, their lowest ranked kind of skill or attribute they bring to a partnership was volunteer recruitment. So that might be something to think about if you're a nonprofit interested in partnering with the government folks, is to say, what could we bring in terms of connecting them with with people. Essentially, if you're a community group, if you're a watershed group, you may have access to people in a way that some of these agencies may feel like they don't have. So keep that in mind as a way that you might be able to pitch your strengths and skills. So I have a question here. What about for-profit environmental service companies? They have expertise. Totally true. This data here that I'm presenting just broke out the nonprofits and the government. I cannot actually remember. We may have had one kind of for-profit respondent to the survey, but it wasn't a big enough sample pool, clearly, to draw any conclusions from. But we will see some folks in some of the case studies that are partnering with businesses in different ways and for service kind of for fee service providers. But they just weren't part of this survey in any meaningful way anyway. But they certainly do have a role. So we asked governments again what they find in their current partners, and you can see there's probably no surprises here. And it jives nicely with the things maybe that the government said that they didn't feel as confident in. Public outreach and education they're really looking for from their current partners. Volunteer recruitment we just talked about. Surprisingly, applying the data, I think that's a great thing. I think it's really an acknowledgement from the government folks that say a watershed group or a community organization can have a really important role in terms of applying the data. They may be able to do it in a way that a government agency really can't, and engage in processes that a government agency can't, or at least in ways that they can't. And they also noted that they were getting some technical expertise, even though they feel very confident in their own technical expertise. That's something that they were also gathering from their partners. So when we asked them what they were looking for, what governments were looking for in their dream date, we came across, probably an unsurprising problem. They're looking for the same thing that nonprofits are looking for, which is funding. Not quite as overwhelmingly, but very clearly funding came out on top, which is, of course, the same thing that nonprofits are looking for in their dream date. Applying the data came in second, and then volunteer recruitment, again, makes sense, as that's a place that they kind of identified maybe not having as strong of skills. The rest of these came in, again, below 50%, so kind of quite a bit lower. Technical expertise, volunteer training, et cetera, were ranked quite a bit lower on the list. So here's the chart that you can't see, but I think hopefully it's the last one you can't see. So we asked the governments the same question: has the economic downturn made you more or less inclined to want to partner? And they were more enthusiastic about partnering post-downturn than nonprofits were even. So 68% of them reported that the downturn had made them very much more likely or much more likely to want to partner. So that's kind of just an interesting angle to keep in mind if you're thinking about approaching a government kind of agency or staff people to talk about partnering, is it may really be on their mind because they have been facing, increasing pressure on their own budgets, their own staff time, et cetera. So not a surprise, but just something to keep in mind. So they are quite a bit more inclined to consider partnering to get their volunteer monitoring work done. So food for thought from this, and then we will move on to the case studies. There's more on the survey results in the report, and I'll share a link with that at the end of the presentation. So there's more things that you might find in there that are useful in terms of thinking through, is partnering good for me, and if so, how should I think about the skills that I bring and the skills a partner might bring? But here's just a few thoughts. Um, as I pointed out, everybody seems to be looking for funding in terms of what they would love from a partner. So a couple things to think about. Nonprofits, if you're a nonprofit, you can go for sources that, say, a local governmental agency or a state agency can't pursue, and vice versa. They may have funding sources that you can't. So even though it's not necessarily new money, bringing that money together on a project might provide benefits, far outweighing what you could do alone, what you could do with two separate pots of money. That's one thing to think about. Even if it doesn't bring you new money, it might bring you diversified money. The other thing to think about is maybe kind of redefining funding. If you're talking to a prospective partner that thinks what they really want is money, you might think about the attributes your organization brings in terms of money. So if you're bringing volunteers, for example, their time is time translates into dollars that might offset the cost that might otherwise be dollars in someone's budget, say a state agency or a local governmental agency. So even though it's not you bringing dollars directly, you are in fact bringing the equivalent of dollars to the table. And that can be true of many things that you might be able to bring to the table, equipment, etc. And we'll see that example throughout these case studies. The Raccoon River in particular, I think we'll see an example of that kind of thinking. And then another kind of food for thought point is governments, as I mentioned, may be more interested in partnering for volunteer monitoring than ever before. So you might really want to think about how to approach, your local state or federal agencies and see if there's interest in this where maybe there hadn't been before. We'll see an example of a nonprofit governmental partnership in the Waccamaw example we talk about. It might give you some food for thought on how you might apply those ideas at home. I'm going to probably harp on this too much, but it's important to remember, I think, from this that nonprofits can bring more than the traditional volunteer skills that we might think of. Not to discount those. Those are really important, and if you're good at them, those are great skills to bring to a partnership. But as we saw in the results, nonprofits see themselves as bringing other things, and so do, say, government agencies. That technical expertise, using the data, getting it kind of incorporated into real-world decision-making, those are important things as well that we should be pitching as nonprofits talking to others about what we could bring to a partnership. And that's the kind of the last point here is this idea of applying the data is really a role to think about. Hopefully that's already something that most groups engage in is, say watershed planning or permitting decisions or what have you. We have a real role to play there in terms of making sure that any data that's collected is used. That can be a really important thing to bring to a partnership because nonprofit organizations might be able to, again, engage in things that, as say, an agency can't, or at least engage in advocacy the way an agency might not be able to, or at a level of detail that others might not be able to as a local organization as opposed to a state agency or what have you. So those are just a few food for thought pieces. I'm going to go to questions here, so if you haven't typed in a question and you have one, please take this time to do it. I have one here from Janet. It says, any comments on QA/QC of data collected by volunteers? That's a very big question, and it gets not so much to the partnership aspect that we're focused on in this webinar. I will say it's a serious issue, and a lot of the resources that are kind of general in nature that I'll point folks to at the end of the webinar for just more basic information on volunteer monitoring will get at that QA/QC question. There's a huge range in terms of what kinds of data volunteers are collecting around the country, what kinds of quality assurance, quality control procedures are in place for that data collection, and then as a result, how that data is used is really varies around the country based on kind of what's being collected and what kinds of procedures, QA/QC or otherwise, are being applied to that data. So it's really a bigger question than the partnership question of this webinar. But again, the resources at the end of the presentation will provide at least links to some information that might be useful on that question. Any other questions before we move into case studies? Not seeing any right at the time, so I'm going to move on. If you're typing away, I will pause and pick up your question. What would it cost to test a local water stream? Again, That's a very broad and general question, more applicable to a webinar that's focused on, generally volunteer water quality monitoring programs. As part of this survey and these case studies, we're not really diving into that level of detail. Um, But again, if you look at some of the resources at the end, you can start to get a feel for some of those questions that are out there. Again, there's a huge range depending on what you want to look at, what you're monitoring for, what tools you're using to monitor, from a really basic kit to a meter. And all of that's really driven by what you want to use your data for at the end of the day. If you're just trying to get a kind of feel for what's going on in the stream, or if you're just working with a school group to get them engaged with the river, you might have a relatively, cheap option for monitoring. If you're looking at something that might be used, data that's going to be used for regulatory purposes, you're going to have much higher standards for the quality of data that you're going to require, and hence you might have a lot more expensive kind of approach. Let me just see here. Do any of your respondents partner with state or regional monitoring councils? Yes, in fact, some of the respondents were those councils. So there were some state-level councils that responded, and we'll see in some of the, actually I don't think in the case studies, I don't think I have one that had a state monitoring council in the case studies I'm presenting here. But some of the respondents certainly were, Alice, part of a regional or statewide monitoring council. So let's dive into the case studies. If you have other questions that you haven't got time to type in, or they're still kind of marinating, type them in at any time, and I'll try to keep an eye on that. So for each of these case studies, I'm going to provide a little bit of background, then talk a little bit about the partnership, and then talk a little bit about how the data is used, since that's often so key to the partnership, and then wrap up with lessons learned. So our first case study here is the Waccamaw River, and this, I think, is a really interesting example. Their program is a strong example of a partnership that's kind of three-way. It's a partnership between a nonprofit, a university, and then several local governments. So it's not just a one-to-one partnership. We've got kind of a triangle driven here. The other thing that's interesting about this is this work is really supported by local stormwater permit requirements. Those permit requirements are what's driving the funding for this project, and hence really driving a lot, not all, but a lot of the use of the data as well. So it's kind of interesting to think about as a funding mechanism if you're trying to figure out how to get an ongoing good funding stream going for your work. So before we get into the specifics, just as background, the Waccamaw River is an outstanding illustration of a southern blackwater stream. It starts in North Carolina, and it flows southeast into South Carolina and then ultimately into the Atlantic Ocean. The river's watershed is still largely either forest or forested wetland, but about 6 to 7% of the watershed is in agricultural use, and another 6 to 7% is in urban use. And it is a developing kind of area as well, so that urban use is the one that's growing. The watershed is still largely healthy. It hits home to rare, threatened, and endangered species of plants, and it has diverse wildlife, including things like American black bear. So, parts of this watershed are pretty healthy and functioning. It also supports diverse recreational uses. It's a drinking water source for local communities, and is described by the project folks as a major economic driver for the region. Yet despite the fact that it's still in pretty good shape, it has some problems, and these include recreational impairments caused by bacterial contamination, so swimming kind of uses impaired for bacteria. There are fish consumption advisories in place for mercury. There's some problems related to wetland losses, and generally issues related to just the increased development in the watershed. So it probably sounds in some ways kind of familiar to a lot of folks in terms of your watershed. So that's the watershed in a nutshell. I'm going to give you a little background on the program, the actual volunteer monitoring program. The program it came out of a group called the Coastal Waccamaw Stormwater Education Consortium. I'm going to call it the consortium because that's way too long to say. This consortium started in 2004, and it's made up mostly of the local governments in the region that banded together with local education providers, and this included nonprofits, state agencies, universities, and others. And they banded together to conduct stormwater outreach and education, so trying to reach out to the public about how to reduce stormwater pollution in this region. Um, the Coastal Carolina University, who we'll talk about a little bit later, and the Waccamaw Riverkeeper, who we'll also talk about, are both founding and continuing members of this consortium. So they were already engaged with these local governments as part of this consortium stormwater effort. So they're part of that effort. At the same time, the Riverkeeper, which is kind of the local watershed group, was interested in creating a volunteer monitoring program. And then as a parallel path, the local governments were really interested in making sure that they could meet their Clean Water Act stormwater permit requirements. These stormwater permit requirements included requirements for public involvement and engagement and education. So as working together through this consortium, they recognized that they probably had kind of some overlapping needs or goals here. And those mutual needs launched the program we're going to be talking about today, which is the Waccamaw River Volunteer Water Quality Monitoring Program. So that's the nonprofit and the local governments coming together and saying, wow, we've kind of got interests here that could serve both of us at the same time if we work together on them. And at the same time as they were kind of realizing that, they realized that they should reach out to the university, Coastal Carolina University, to provide technical support. That this was a need that they couldn't fill between their partnership. They needed to bring in another partner, the university. So they did that, and they established this program in 2006. And just as a quick overview, the program monitors 12 sites in South Carolina and just recently added another 6 in North Carolina. They work with about 50 volunteers, and they work in terms of teams of 3 to 5. And they sample several sites, anywhere from 1 to 3, each of these teams. And they sample twice a month, year-round, because we're talking about the South. And they monitor for a wide variety of things. So these include dissolved oxygen, pH, conductivity, temperature, ammonia, nitrate, nitrite. They also do turbidity measures, and they do bacteria counts for E. coli and total chloroform. So they're covering a lot of sites. They're monitoring for quite a few parameters, and they're doing it pretty regularly, twice a month. And then the volunteers, they collect this data, and they go home, they enter their data into an online database, and then that data is quality control checked by staff, which is basically a volunteer monitoring coordinator and some other administrative staff, before that data is then approved and made publicly accessible online. So it's accessible to the volunteers and really to anybody that might be interested in it. So that's a quick overview of their program. If we talk specifically about the partnership, so this partnership is really key to making the overall program work. And again, it brings together a nonprofit, a university, and local governments. So I'm going to talk about each entity's role a little bit here. The Watershed Group, which is the Waccamaw Riverkeeper, they recruit, train, and manage the volunteer monitors. And they host an annual public meeting where all the data from the volunteer monitoring is shared and discussed with everybody, just general stakeholders, the public, media, the local governments, and others that might be involved in decision-making in the region. It's just a wide, open public meeting that they run. They also host an annual meeting that's just for the volunteers, where they talk about the data, talk about any new changes to the program, and do any kind of training that's necessary. The Riverkeeper also works as part of the quality assurance, quality control procedures to review incoming data that volunteers submit, and they notify any agencies, say the state agencies or the local governments, if monitoring shows potential problems, including illicit discharges that they might suspect as a result of their monitoring results. So the Waccamaw Riverkeeper and its volunteers then assist those regulatory agencies in following up to see, do we need to find where that illicit discharge is, or is there some other kind of problem that we need to follow through to resolution? So that's the role of the nonprofit, the Riverkeeper. You can see they play several roles, ranging from that kind of volunteer angle to technical, through their quality control review, to applying the data, really following up and seeing how that's used on the ground. The next partner, the university, they manage the financial side of the project, so all the grants, et cetera, just what needs to be done in terms of financing. They house the volunteer monitoring coordinator. They maintain this online database that volunteers use to submit their data and that the public can access. They purchase and maintain equipment, and they coordinate some of the technical requirements, such as the quality assurance, quality control, project plans, those kinds of things. So Again, they're kind of serving multiple roles there, from the finance side of things to this idea of maybe technical support in terms of the quality assurance, quality control procedures, and managing the data. Both of the nonprofit and the university are involved with regularly interacting with the local government, so that's another role they play to make sure that the government is getting what they need out of this project. And then lastly, the local government's role is kind of an interesting one. They're definitely key partners in this effort. They provide funding for the volunteer monitoring program through stormwater utility fees that the three local governments gather from their ability to do that, to gather these fees from residents. And that funds the effort that the other partners are kind of taking on the ground. The reason they do this is that these entities, these local governments, are covered by a stormwater permit, which I mentioned earlier. It's a Clean Water Act permit, which really motivates their participation because that permit has some specific requirements that they have to comply with. And these include requirements for public education and outreach, as I mentioned, public involvement and participation, which the volunteers are doing, as well as people who might come to that annual meeting to look at the data, and illicit discharge detection. So again, if the program's monitoring effort sees a problem in a place and you go out and follow up, what you might find is that you're looking for this illicit discharge, somebody who's discharging into the stream, maybe through the stormwater system. And so that helps these local governments meet their requirements under their permits. And so that's why this is a wise use, maybe, of their stormwater utility fees. So I thought that was an interesting funding mechanism that this partnership had brought into play, and it provides for a pretty steady, consistent funding stream. So the way the data is used, it's used in several ways here. I'll just touch on a few. In the report, you can read more about this. Most directly, the local governments are using the data as part of their stormwater management plan. So as I mentioned, when this data comes in, there's a provisional analysis done, looks at the reported results, summarizes findings and trends, and that is shared with the local governments. It's also used, again, to detect these illicit discharges, things that might be causing a problem in the stream that you can trace back up perhaps to a connection to the stormwater system. The way that this illicit discharge angle has been connected up is very interesting, and you can read more about it in the report. But at its most basic, the university has basically established a method for looking at the data that they receive from volunteers and identifying what they call somewhat unusual, it's a quote, or highly unusual results for each sampling site. And they base it on a percentile threshold that they compute from the 7 years of data that they have from the program. And so if they see one of those results, they're able to identify conditions that might require immediate attention, because those highly kind of unusual conditions might be indicative of something like an illicit discharge. So it's basically like a warning flag pops up, more or less, on some of the data that's submitted, and the local governments are able to use that to follow up and go look for problems. Their data is also used through public meetings, for education. There's lots of other uses of the data. Again, you can look at the report for more information about it. One other point I wanted to make is that the Waccamaw Riverkeeper and their partners, they're currently revising their quality assurance project plan. And the reason they're doing that is that they want to get that plan approved by their state agency, the South Carolina Department of Environmental Control. The reason they want to do that is that if they have an approved quality assurance project plan in place, their data can then be used by the state agency for official kind of regulatory purposes, like, again, identifying waters that aren't meeting water quality standards and might be impaired and in need of restoration. So right now they cannot do that with the data that they have, but if they're able to get their project plan approved, they'll be able to do that. They did say, however, that they share their data with the state agency, and the agency can use that to target their own monitoring to follow up in a place and see if there is a problem that should be used in a regulatory manner. So it's not as if that data isn't informing the state agency as well. It just can't officially be used for regulatory purposes, at least as it currently stands. So a few quick lessons here on the Waccamaw River case study, and then if you have questions after I run through these, we'll pause for questions again. Again, there's a lot more in the report on this, but a couple ideas that came out of this case study for me is that, tying your volunteer monitoring program efforts to an existing need, particularly as in this case, something that's a regulatory requirement for a community, can help provide steady investment through your partnership. So this is an ongoing problem for monitoring programs, this need for long-term investment. It's hard to keep that money, flowing and in place. And you can see in this example, they got around that problem by connecting what they were doing with the stormwater permit program requirements and making sure that the data that's being generated really serves an important need for the communities that are partnering with the nonprofit and the university. So it really does make a difference to have that kind of ongoing need. Next up, one of the points that the folks involved in this partnership made to me that I thought was really interesting is that a partnership can enhance the credibility of your data and also of the individual partners involved in the project. So in a well-designed partnership, your data is just going to be that much more defensible because it's supported by a diverse range of partners. So in this case, having a nonprofit, a university, and a local government involved, they really felt like made a big difference in terms of the data credibility. And the Riverkeeper told me that they also found that they themselves as an organization found increased credibility because they were working directly with the regulators, in this case the local governments in charge of stormwater permitting, and in some ways the state agency as well in terms of sharing data that might help them target their efforts. And that helped their credibility with their partners and also with the community. It wasn't just them. They were bringing in these kind of diverse folks. Another quick lesson learned, working in partnership may strengthen your relationship with the partners in ways that you hadn't thought about. So this was, again, something that the folks in the case study raised for me that I hadn't really thought about. But they said, working together, they were able to develop a stronger relationship that made discussions about other, more maybe controversial topics easier for all parties involved. So I have a little quote here from Dave Fuss, who's from Horry County, one of the local government partners. And he said, one of the advantages of the partnership is that we have diffused the adversarial relationship that sometimes exists between government and nonprofit environmental advocacy groups. We already have open communication lines, and the elected and appointed officials are more familiar with Riverkeeper, so that comments about proposed development projects are taken more seriously and not readily dismissed. So it's just kind of human nature. You work together on something like this volunteer monitoring effort, and when something else comes up, maybe something that's a little harder to talk productively about, you've got something you're building from. So I think that's really worth thinking about as you're designing your program and thinking about possible benefits of partnership. I won't harp on this one too much, but we'll see it time and again that smart partnerships kind of design from the beginning to make sure that all partners are actively engaged. You don't really want a partner that doesn't feel invested in the program. So, everything from the design of the program, what your goals are, how you're going to go about, monitoring, how often you're monitoring, all of those things in the beginning should be something that all the partners are engaged with and, can come to some agreement around, and then design these ongoing opportunities for engagement. An example in this case study is this annual meeting where folks come together and really share the data and talk about necessary changes, if any, and, really address kind of the full program all as a group. So make sure that you're building that into any kind of partnership you might be contemplating. And lastly, this is probably obvious, but I thought this was a good place to throw it out there. Partnerships are going to provide resources that might not be available otherwise. That's in some ways the whole idea. So at least the bottom line idea is looking for resources or skills that you might not have. And in this example, I think the Riverkeeper really sees huge value, of course in the funding stream from the local governments, but also in terms of the university's technical expertise, their ability to host this very nice online database that maybe a Watershed group would not really have the time or resources to develop. There's just all kinds of things that partners bring to the table that you might not otherwise have. So with that, any questions about that first quick case study there? Looks like I don't think I see any new questions in the chat. So if you do have any, feel free to to type them in at any time. We'll come back around to them. In the interest of time, I'll just kind of keep going for now. Our next example is a little more urban for those folks here from the Urban Waters Network. This is Johnson Creek in Oregon. I really like this as an example of kind of a partnership between two nonprofits. So this is one-to-one. There's just two partners, and they're both nonprofits coming together to play to the strengths of both organizations. I also like it because it has a really unique, well, different anyway, monitoring approach. They're monitoring mussels, freshwater mussels, as opposed to the more common things we might see in a program. And it also illustrates the fact that in some cases nonprofits can bring serious scientific or technical skills to the table. So as background, Johnson Creek flows 26 miles from its headwaters near the Sandy River to its confluence with the Willamette. You can see here on the map. It passes through 4 cities in that time, including the very urban Portland. And it drains into the Willamette, which then ultimately flows through the Columbia and, of course, then on to the Pacific. So I mentioned one of the things I like about this is the mussels. So there's a not very good mussel picture. But in terms of the monitoring program basics, the Johnson Creek Watershed Council, they run several monitoring projects. This case study in the report focused on their mussel monitoring project. This is one conducted in partnership with the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation, so a group interested in invertebrates, including mussels. The Mussel Project was piloted in 2008 and has since monitored 4 new sites each year, uses 20 to 40 volunteers each year. There are additional sites that are monitored by staff, but that's the volunteer program. The project is striving to document freshwater mussel populations in Johnson Creek using pretty simple presence and absence surveys. Are they there? Are they not? And the survey is looking at 2 native mussels and 1 invasive species, the Asian clam. And the goals of this project include several things, generating really simple, kind of cost-effective baseline data on mussel species and distribution in the watershed, increasing the resident and stakeholder awareness of mussels, just the fact that they're there, and providing data to help inform stream management decisions, so kind of that application of the data on the ground. One thing I will point out, just because, again, I'm kind of personally fascinated with this, is mussels are a really interesting angle for a volunteer monitoring project. There were several technical reasons why the society wanted to focus in on mussels. They pointed out that they're one of the most at-risk group of animals and plants in the U.S. They're extremely understudied, according to the society, and yet they can be very good indicators for stream health. They can serve that purpose because they're pretty sensitive to water quality changes. They have long lives, so they're there for a long time, and they're pretty stationary. So they really can be kind of a record of what's going on in the watershed, or at least at that point in the watershed, that location. The other interesting thing, though, came from the Watershed Council's volunteer coordinator, and she pointed out that they found that one of the great things about this project is their really particularly kind of physical and graspable volunteer monitoring experiences when you're looking for mussels. This is a quote from their outreach coordinator. She said, "Monitoring for mussels has connected our volunteers with the watershed in a very physical way, in a way that chemical monitoring just can't do. The mussels are visible and touchable. We found mussel beds in places we never expected to find them and found beds that were more than 80 years old. This excites us and our volunteers." And we'll hear that throughout this case study. It's just kind of an interesting way to engage your volunteers. So this partnership component of this case study, though, is really about these two nonprofits coming together. So the society, the Xerces Society, was the initial force behind the mussel monitoring project. They received a grant to launch a pilot project, and they reached out to the council to help them with the implementation. They said they saw value in the council's detailed knowledge of the watershed and in the council's really strong skills in volunteer recruitment and management. For their part, the society was saying that they would bring to the table a PhD-level expert to design the study and establish really credible methodologies for training the volunteers. Then, of course, the society was also providing the initial funding, and then they managed later grants that came in as well. So from the society's viewpoint, working with volunteers to collect the data, provided a lot of benefits beyond just the data itself. Because if you remember, one of the goals of the project was just letting people know about mussels in the watershed, just educating people about the role they play and the threats to them. So they really felt like that was a huge part of the benefit of partnering with Johnson Creek Watershed Council, was to have that connection with people in the watershed. Um, and while the initial roles that were kind of imagined for this, the volunteer recruitment and training and maintenance for the council, and then more of the technical and funding roles of the society, they did prove beneficial. Both organizations said they found additional benefits as the project matured. It's just one example. The society said they found that access to the creek for monitoring was made much easier as a result of their partnership with the council, because the council had existing relationships with landowners. They didn't have to start from scratch. They could talk to people they knew and get permission to just cross the land and get to the creek. On the council's part, they said that they found that their volunteers really found the scientific angle of this project really invigorating. Like learning from a PhD was a huge selling point in terms of getting people engaged that might have, either not been engaged before, not been that inspired by other projects, or might have been long-term volunteers that were maybe just kind of burnt out on simpler, projects like, say, a stream cleanup or basic monitoring. That having this selling point of working with, a real scientist on the project was in itself a selling point for the council in terms of getting people involved. So like the outreach coordinator here, I have a quote from her. She says, having access to a PhD level scientist who can actually communicate with volunteers about the science of the project and can develop the protocols that are credible has been a huge benefit. It was attractive to a different group of volunteers in some of our other projects. And there were lots of other kind of unexpected benefits that came up, things like, permitting for working with mussels, which are in this instance a state-sensitive species and require some additional kind of work in terms of getting approval to work with them. There were lots of things that were just made easier by this partnership, and you can read a little bit more about them in the report if you're interested. This is my favorite picture of the whole presentation. This is how you monitor for mussels, the scope. You have to have your bum in the air and scope out what's going on the bottom of the stream to see where the mussels are or are not. But what I want to talk about here just quickly is how the data has been used from this, because it is very central to the partnership, again, to think about how your data is going to be used. The two partners have used it in kind of different ways, but definitely have overlapped. The society has taken maybe more of some of the academic uses of the data in hand. So they've shared the data with an interagency working group focused on kind of tracking the status and trends of native mussels in the region. They are working on publishing some of the findings in kind of academic journals to get at this problem of how understudied the species are. So they're really, focused in on some of these more academic or technical angles. But the on-the-ground uses of the data are even more compelling. Because the society is maintaining all this data in a database, they can and do now respond to inquiries from local governments and others about the locations of mussel beds. And this has allowed folks that are maybe working in a stream, say installing a bridge or capping contaminated sediments, to salvage the mussels before the project is underway and then relocate the animals, which might otherwise have been killed. And this society can also kind of help people who might not know much about mussels that are inquiring on how to do that properly and what it might entail. On the council's side, they plan to use this data to assist in prioritization of their own restoration projects they're doing in the watershed. So maybe prioritizing where they think they can really help the mussels or protect the mussels. And also to make sure that restoration projects they're doing aren't harming the mussels. So if there's mussels in the area, they might have to redesign their approach depending on what they had planned there. So lots of different ways the data is being used by the different partners, and some overlap between the two, but having the two partners using it in different ways means the data is being used that much more. So again, kind of a benefit of the partnership. So again, after this slide, I'll pause for any questions. So if you've got some, you might want to start typing now, because I've been talking a lot. I want to make sure there's still people out there. So Johnson Creek, a few lessons learned here that I will share. Again, there's more in the report and more detail on these. One that I've been harping on is, don't assume you know what any particular organization or entity can contribute. In this case, it's that question of, should we pigeonhole nonprofits as just good with volunteers, but not good at the technical side of things? Here's a case where a nonprofit is bringing a huge technical capacity to the table and really designing a totally different kind of projects based on those skills that they brought to the council. So really explore the potential universe of partners that are out there and what they might be able to contribute. So this is one that I spend a lot of time thinking about with this story is, make sure you're reaching beyond what might be sister organizations to what I might call cousins. So, sister organizations might be others that are really interested in water quality. We say that the State Water Quality Agency or neighboring Watershed group or the state level river group. You should, of course, work with those, but also think about cousins. In this case, we've got a group that's really interested in the watershed, a place, and the issues that are affecting that watershed. And then we have someone interested in invertebrates. And what brings them together is the habitat of the watershed. So clearly they have a lot in common, but might not be exactly, a sister organization. They're more like cousins. So make sure you think through, in your case, who might be my cousin that we could find some overlapping interests and make a strong partnership out of. This is very related, but let a potential partnership expand your horizons. If you're thinking about monitoring in its broadest sense of documenting your watershed, you can cover a lot of ground with that idea. Of course, you want to have clear goals for why you're monitoring and how you're going to use the data, but at least when you're thinking about a possible partnership, back up and let yourself think broadly. So in the example of this mussel project, there's lots of benefits to looking at monitoring mussels as opposed to, or in addition to, maybe more traditional water quality parameters. In this case, as we mentioned, it's a new idea for volunteers to get excited about. They can actually see the mussels as opposed to maybe trying to see pollution. Sometimes hard, sometimes depressingly not hard. Mussels also just document the watershed in a really different way, and in some ways might be a broader record of health of the watershed. There's just a lot of benefits to thinking about it a little bit differently in this project. So shake yourself up and consider what else you might monitor for that would move you towards your goals if you had the right partner. So, is it partnering with somebody who could help you look at recreational visits to the watershed or particular habitats that might need special consideration, or fish health? If you've been looking at water quality parameters, maybe partnering with somebody can help you get directly at the fish. Beaver populations. There's just all kinds of different things that, maybe those aren't things that relate to your goals, but back up and try to think about what else, if I wasn't limited to what I really know about, could I expand into that would get me farther along toward what my goals are. This is probably obvious again, but it really came out in interviewing the folks involved with this partnership that, if you want to have a successful partnership, it's really important to know what you do well and just, own it, and also really respect what your partner brings to the table. These two entities, they were just amazing to listen to how they talked about their own work, but also their respect for their partner and what that partner was bringing to the table. And their roles were really quite clearly delineated, which I think is, very helpful in any partnership situation. They didn't have any kind of huge contract that, tied them to anything in particular. They basically, wrote up their work plans through grant proposals, but it was enough. They knew where their strengths were and what they could lean on their partner to deliver, and what they, were really on board for. So really think about how, if you're working with somebody, how can you be really clear about what you're good at and what you're bringing, and make sure that you're equally clear about what they're bringing to the table. And maybe a little bit in contrast to that is incorporating adaptive management or flexibility basically into your plans. As much as you want to really have clear roles, preserve as much flexibility as you can, because things are going to come up that you can't anticipate in a partnership project, just like any project you do. And it can be that much harder to be flexible if you're working with a partner. So maybe talk ahead of time about, well, what are we going to do if we have to respond to something that we don't anticipate? How can we be flexible together and yet still be really clear about it? You can read in the case study, this came up in several ways for this project, and they were able to be really nimble in terms of adjusting what they had in terms of their expectations of their own workload or what their partner might be accountable for. They were able to be very flexible and nimble in terms of adjusting the plans that they had. Definitely worth thinking about ahead of time. All right, I don't see any questions coming in over here. That's supposed to be a question slide, but the image is missing. Um, so I will ask, just I would like to hear from folks just to make sure I know you're still alive out there before I go into the next case study. Um, how many of you have and this is just not for volunteer monitoring partnerships, but I'm sure there's projects you've worked on in partnership with other organizations or agencies. How many of you have had a written kind of agreement, maybe some sort of memorandum of understanding or some other contract that you put in place to guide that partnership? You can raise your hand, or if you want to add, more thoughts to it, you could type it in the chat. It's like just a few people have had some sort of written agreement in a partnership situation. Somebody says in the comments they use MOAs. Somebody said, sure wish we did. We're struggling with adapting the program right now, so there's an endorsement for thinking about these things maybe ahead of time. Better late than never is probably the way to think about that. I see some other people are typing. Okay, so only a few that are more written and structured. I see somebody here saying sometimes for grant applications. That seems to be one of the places we get serious is when we're looking at money. You got to write something down. But again, another person saying written into grant proposal. And we've had one person here who said, sure wish that we had had some sort of written agreement. Has anybody else had any sort of problems that made them wish that they had put things in writing in a partnership? Again, not just about volunteer monitoring, but just generally anything that you're looking back on it, you sure wish you had done a memorandum of understanding or of agreement or some sort of contract. Raise your hand if you have experienced things that make you wish you'd gone down that road. Wow, either you guys are asleep or you have excellent partnership relationships, because I'm only seeing really one person raise their hand there. I will say the reason I asked that question, beyond checking to see if everybody's still there, is I was surprised by how few of these partnerships have, written structures in place to guide them. Usually we think of, some sort of structure as really helpful in a coalition or an alliance or what have you. And in a lot of these, it's pretty informal. And when I wrap up, I'll say my opinion on this from talking with folks and thinking about partnership more broadly is it's probably wise to keep any agreement as simple as you can, but having something in writing is probably helpful, and at the very least, having a detailed discussion about things that you might anticipate at the beginning is really important. I've got a few other comments here, and then we'll look at the last case studies. It says we have an active MOU for restoration project with the city, but wish we would have more often with municipalities on monitoring. So there's a case where there's one in place for one project, but maybe it would be a good idea for others. Here's a comment. Most often these issues revolve around not fully stepping up to the plate. I think formal agreements make us think about more often of problems of overstepping boundaries. Both are problematic. I think that's a good point. Yeah, really, again, making sure those roles are clear, both what you do and maybe what you don't do. I think that's helpful. Okay, well, I'm going to move on to the last case study here. This is a little bit different case study. It's on the Raccoon River in Iowa, and it involves a volunteer monitoring project by a group called Agricultural's Clean Water Alliance, which I find hard to say, so I'm going to call them the Alliance from here on out. And this is an example of a diverse partnership involving a lot of different interests, including some business or corporate interests, and how they were able to create a reliable funding solution to support pretty intensive, technically rigorous, ongoing monitoring that was focused on a really specific issue of joint concern. So before we dive in, what we're looking at here is the Raccoon River is the highlighted watershed, but we'll talk about kind of the Des Moines River and the Raccoon. So the Des Moines begins in southwestern Minnesota, you can see here on the map, and flows generally southeast. It's joined by the Raccoon River just south of downtown Des Moines, and it flows on to the Mississippi. The Raccoon and Des Moines both drain just millions of acres of farmland in central Iowa. And these rivers also provide drinking water to about 500,000 Iowans, so a big drinking water source. In the 1990s, there were increasing nitrate concentrations in the rivers that resulted in the need for a large investment, about $4 million, in nitrate treatment at the Des Moines Water Works facility in Des Moines. And this was to comply with US EPA's what's called a maximum contaminant level, or MCL, for nitrate in drinking water. It's a 10 milligram per liter MCL, kind of a limit what's safe in the drinking water. So this project was really started in a way, at least had its roots in a study that was done in 1999. This was a broad study in the watersheds, collecting data from a large area all at the same time. And it was funded by US EPA and led by the Des Moines Water Works. It used volunteer data collectors, at least in part. There were others as well. And so among other things that the study did was that it demonstrated that really good, solid data could be collected by trained volunteers. Made people kind of see that as a useful way to gather data. At about the same time, the Des Moines Water Works was reaching out to fertilizer retailers in the watershed, specifically in the Raccoon, with the goal of engaging the retailers in a discussion about the role of fertilizer management on water quality in both the Raccoon and the Des Moines rivers. So we've got this kind of monitoring effort that's going on, looking at the problem, the nitrate problem, and then you've got the waterworks folks also talking with fertilizer retailers about the problem and what maybe should be done about it. As a result of all this attention and these discussions on fertilizers and water quality, the local fertilizer retailers came together in 2000, so the next year, to form this group that we're talking about today, Agricultural's Clean Water Alliance, or the Alliance. And their mission is really to reduce nutrient loss, specifically nitrates from farm fields, and keep those nutrients from getting into the Des Moines and Raccoon rivers. So as part of that mission, they looked back at this study that was done using volunteer data collectors and said, we really want to set up a volunteer monitoring effort that will be ongoing and run with that in these watersheds. So the project was set up as a part of the Alliance's kind of programming, and it monitors for a variety of parameters, not just nitrate, but includes nitrate, phosphorus, bacteria, dissolved oxygen, temperature, and turbidity. It's not a huge program in terms of the number of volunteers. For example, the most recent year of data, at least that I could find, was 2011, and they used 29 certified volunteers that covered 107 sites. But they collected nearly 1,200 samples over the course of that year. Each site gets monitored every 2 weeks from April through July, so kind of that runoff season from the farm fields. And the project draws its volunteers from a diverse kind of sampling of local interests, and this is where some of the other partnerships come into play. These include soil and water conservation districts, the county conservation boards, Future Farmers of America, as well as local watershed groups. So that's kind of the watershed nonprofit angle. The laboratory work and analysis was originally done by the Des Moines Water Works, but today that work has been taken over by staff at a nonprofit organization, the Iowa Soybean Association. It's kind of an agricultural nonprofit there in the Soybean Association. So the partnership aspect of this, again, is a little different than the ones we've looked at. It's not so much two organizations coming together or three or what have you. The alliance has brought together partners in different ways. So the heart of the alliance is made up of 13 agricultural retailers. These are those fertilizer retailers that we were talking about earlier that the Waterworks folks have been reaching out to. The retailers play several roles in terms of the overall reduction of nitrate pollution in the watershed, but in terms of the monitoring effort that we're talking about, it's their financial support that is most critical. So the retailers pay annual member dues to the Alliance, and those dues come out of a percentage of their annual nitrogen fertilizer sales. So it's kind of like a ding, say, on every pound or what have you, of fertilizer sold, nitrate fertilizer sold, generates more money that goes into their dues that then goes on to the monitoring project. So that's used for the monitoring program costs. So just to give you kind of a scale of it, this is from the Alliance's annual report, I think a year ago. They say since 1999, the members have invested more than $1 million in the monitoring program, and well over 10,000 samples were collected by about 100 certified samplers using those resources. So this is a way that they've set up this kind of consistent funding stream to keep the monitoring going longer term, which is, again, so often the challenge. Another key partner in this effort that comes in kind of under the Alliance umbrella is the Iowa Soybean Association. I mentioned them earlier. They're a group of soybean producers who came together to look at ways that farmers can, expand their profit opportunities, make money, while they're also promoting more environmentally sensitive production efforts. So they've kind of got this twofold mission. So as part of that vision, the staff of the Iowa Soybean Association have been providing technical and administrative support to the Alliance's volunteer monitoring project. So their role was really kind of this overall support and program management. They provide the volunteer training, they host the lab, they manage the logistics for the monitoring days, and they even manage the board of the Alliance. Other partners that I won't go into in detail include the local watershed groups as a volunteer kind of source, the USGS, the National Laboratory for Agriculture and the Environment, and the Des Moines Water Works is still involved, the drinking water utility that has a clear concern about nitrate. There's even some corporate entities that have been involved in terms of financial contributions. This is another one where, despite the fact that it's a pretty big and diverse alliance, when I talk to them about how they set the structure up for it, it's a very informal structure, and the roles have really evolved over the years, with the Soybean Association taking on more, and the Des Moines Water Works maybe letting go of some things. And they've been able to do all of that through really informal structures, mostly just through this board of directors of the Alliance. So I thought that was kind of interesting again. In terms of the use of the data, there's more on this again in the report, but I think it is exciting that their data has been used pretty extensively in pretty meaningful ways. For one example, the Iowa Department of Natural Resources has used their data to develop what's called a Total Maximum Daily Load, or TMDL, restoration plan for the Raccoon and Des Moines rivers. They've also used the data to target sub-watersheds for restoration through the USDA's Mississippi River Basin Initiative. And it's even just been used to write grant proposals for restoration projects, so kind of providing the baseline data to say, yeah, we need to get in here and do some restoration in this sub-watershed, say, or with these 3 farmers, and here's the data that proves we need to do it, and here's how we're going to measure whether or not we're having an impact. These are often really challenging pieces of information to put together for a restoration project, and they now have this data as part of this volunteer monitoring project. So diverse use of the data, and there's some other discussion of that in the report that you can look at. So lessons learned here, again, more on all of these in the report. But this is kind of like the Waccamaw in terms of thinking about seeing who might invest in your volunteer monitoring project because they stand to benefit from the data or have other needs that are going to be met by the project. So in this case, you really see the project's funding mechanism is really driven by the fact that the fertilizer entities are really needing to be able to document what's going on and what kinds of improving trends, hopefully, are coming out of the work they're doing in terms of fertilizer management efforts, et cetera. So there's basically just an investment in the need for this data from all of the partners. Very similarly here, identifying common concerns of partners right up front. This nitrate problem in these watersheds brought a diverse mix of people together, from the drinking water utility in Des Moines, the waterworks folks, to the agricultural interests that are really involved in the nitrate as a source of the problem on the front lines. So very much finding this common area of concern and really focusing in on it. They collected data on a diverser range of parameters, but this nitrate issue was really what was able to make the partnership come together and focus. Again, a regulatory driver can really help focus everyone on their efforts. We saw in the Waccamaw the stormwater permit angle. In this case, it was really the drinking water MCL, the maximum contaminant level, that focused everybody in on this very concrete problem. And if you have something like that you can build your project around and then your partnership around, it can be helpful. It can also be stressful and may bring controversy to the table, but it can help make sure that everybody keeps engaged in the process as well. One kind of softer lesson that the project folks brought up to me that I thought I would mention here is really making sure that, as much as we're all focused on our goals and you want to have a clear focus for your monitoring effort, if you get some unexpected benefits, make sure to tout those and make sure that all the partners really see the benefits that are coming from those unexpected places. So this is a quote from a staff person from the Soybean Association. And he says, this monitoring has been used to target and get several restoration and runoff control projects going. I don't think we initially realized how many doors this data would open. The data has been used to bring in lots of project dollars to different areas, and those dollars generally go to the retailer's customers, so the farmers. Um, it is important to keep telling the board, as they don't see this day-to-day like the staff does. So you can see that the board is largely made up of the fertilizer retailers, so the folks selling to farmers. It's important for them to hear if their clients, essentially their customers, are really receiving a benefit. They pay this kind of ding on their fertilizer sales, but that money is coming back around and helping their customers in a way that everybody needs to kind of be aware of and make hay with. And the last lesson learned on this one is, again, probably pretty obvious, but go figure, money helps get the job done. The fact that they were able to set up this creative funding mechanism is really helping the partnership stay alive, keep functioning, and just collect data on this long-term basis. And even at the micro level, money is helping. I mentioned this just because I'd never really heard it before. Maybe I'm just missing it, but this project actually pays their trained volunteers $10 per sample. And the idea is to allow these volunteers to cover their costs, traveling to the scene, et cetera. And they said, perhaps even come away with a small profit. And I think that would probably be if you didn't count your time. But the reason that the partnership did this, or the alliance did this, was they said, what it was Seaman, who's the staff person for the Iowa Soybean Association, said that they have a 99% follow-through rate on scheduled sampling. And that's really important because they're using this data, as very technically sound, high quality data. They want to make sure that they have data at the times that they're looking to collect it, that they have regular, visits, etc. And with a 99%, follow-through rate, you're making sure that you really are getting a good record, a good consistent record that can be used for things like developing a total maximum daily load restoration plan. So even on that small level, it's probably not a surprise that money helps. So we're getting near the bottom of the hour here. I'll just pause and see if there's any questions. I have a few people who have signed off, but I'm going to see here if there's any questions, a few comments. I don't really see any questions. So I'll just go right to the wrap-up slides here. A lot of these other general lessons I've probably harped on, so I'll just kind of put them up here as we're closing out. We already talked about maybe thinking through how explicit and detailed and how in writing your partnership needs to be. We talked about looking for levers that might engage those that are not traditionally involved. Again, maybe it's a permitting issue or a concern about drinking water or, heck, invertebrates in the case of the Johnson Creek study. Try to think maybe a little bit non-traditionally about who might be useful as a partner. Pitch what you bring to a partnership based on the needs you see from your potential partner. That's just kind of human nature. And again, stress this one more than enough. Don't pigeonhole what your potential partners might bring. And this last one I will touch on just because it came out in a case study that I didn't feature here. And that is, even places where your potential partner has maybe a duplication of the skills and capacities that you have, remember that can be helpful. That can be beneficial. It might allow you to expand the geographic area that you're covering by teaming up or monitor more often. Or it might allow you to free up, say you're both really good at volunteer training and maintenance, perhaps if you partner with somebody else, you could free up a little bit of your time to build your technical capacity, which you've always wanted to do but not had the time to do. So even, where it seems like maybe there's some overlap, don't think of that necessarily as a bad thing. And there's other lessons, again, in the report if you're interested and you want to kind of check it out, and we talk about these in more detail. So I promised just a few resources here at the end. I've provided here a weird shortened link to the full report. So if you did want to follow up, there's more on all of this and an additional case study in that report. And the other two bullets are getting at some of the questions that you all were raising in the beginning, which were really much more about, how do you design a volunteer monitoring program, and how do you deal with concerns maybe about quality assurance and quality control and making sure your data is really credible. The links provided here will give you at least a starting point to look at some of those issues that are really more about the fundamentals of monitoring before you even get to thinking about partnership with anybody. So we've got the National Water Quality Monitoring Council's page on volunteer monitoring. It's a great resource. And then US EPA, of course, they have a lot of really good materials there that will be very helpful in ways to connect up with networks of others that are doing volunteer monitoring that, again, outside of this partnership question, just cover a wide range of issues. So I'm going to paste the hyperlink into the chat here as somebody has requested. And we have just another minute here. If there's anybody that does have a question or even just comment that you want to throw out that you think might be helpful for others. Any last thoughts or questions? Got a few people typing, so we're at the bottom of the hour, but I'll stay on for as long as you guys have thoughts or questions you want to share. So here's a question. If we have a local fundraiser and give the funds to a nonprofit for a specific issue such as water monitoring, should we ask for a letter that says the money will be put towards that use? There are probably people on the phone that know more about like the ins and outs of this than I do. So if you want to type a response or speak up on the phone, please feel free to. I would say you'd be entirely within your rights to do so, just an acknowledgement. There's a concept called donor intent, and if funds are given with a specific kind of intent attached to them, we as nonprofits are supposed to respect that. And communicating that in writing as you send in the donation, I think would be very useful, and asking for an acknowledgement of that would be completely reasonable. Just make sure that it's clear that everybody knows what that donor intent is in that case. But if others have thoughts on that issue, feel free to share them. I'm seeing there's still several people typing, so I will stay on a little bit longer here. Oh, I see we have a couple thanks, and then there is an evaluation. I should have mentioned that. Thank you, Ryan. He's put a link to the evaluation in the chat box, and I think that it pops up when the webinar closes as well. So as you log out, you may see that. All right, we're just mostly seeing thank yous and not questions. So I will just wrap up and say, feel free to contact me at any time if you do have questions before or after checking out that report, and I'd love any feedback you have. So thanks for your time today.